Hi, class. So, in this lecture, we're going to do a little comparison of Poe and Coleridge. Hopefully, you had a chance to read the critical article in our anthology, Poe's Debt to Coleridge. So, I thought it was kind of interesting. So, that's going to be the focus this week. A little background then on Samuel Taylor Coleridge. He, of course, co-founded the Romantic movement in literature along with William Wordsworth. In the last module, we talked about how Ralph Waldo Emerson traveled abroad, learned of Wordsworth and Coleridge, met with them, and thought to himself, that if an ordinary person could go out in nature and enjoy nature and write poetry, then why couldn't everyone? And of course, that kind of helped spawn the Transcendentalist movement. And of course, Poe and the rest of the dark romanticists were kind of against that. However, Edgar Allan Poe does owe some of his style, some of his poetic theory to Coleridge. So let's talk a little bit about that. As we know, Romanticism, British Romanticism there was an emphasis on emotion and individualism, right? There was against the government, constructed religion, right? So a lot of this parallels with Ralph Waldo Emerson, which we talked about last week. Coleridge's famous poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. It baffles many. It baffled me. I read it 2 or 3 times in college. But the line that kind of is important, stands out, is this one. Well, first of all, what is a lyrical ballad, right? A ballad tells a story. It's a narrative, right? And a lyric is something that brings out emotion, right? A lot of emotion. And a ballad tells a story. So basically, this is about this mariner, right? Kind of disrupts this party. Everybody's getting their drink on, so to speak. And he's all, I'm going to tell you this story about how I killed this albatross and it brought me bad luck. Nobody really knows why he does it, but it's interesting nonetheless. And this is the line that probably sums up the poem best. Ah, well a day, what evil looks had I from old and young. Instead of the cross, the albatross about my neck was hung. Notice the rhyme scheme there. Looks, albatross, young, hung. So basically at this point, rather than wearing the cross around his neck, the mariner that killed this albatross that actually brought the ship and the people good luck, they forced him to wear it around his neck. Not only that, getting to a little bit of ethos here, the mariner knew that by shooting this thing, right? We've all heard the term hindsight's 2020. Well, he had the hindsight, right? But he went ahead and committed this act anyway. And that's a question that a lot of people try to answer to this day. So that's a little bit about Coleridge and Romanticism. Now, as I said, Poe does pay a lot of debt to Coleridge, right? But mostly in Poe's poetry. So that's what we're going to focus on this week. And this is taken from that critical article that I wanted you to read. Right? So this is Poe's theory, and a lot of it is based off of Poe's reading and understanding of Coleridge. The object of poetry is pleasure, not truth. So in other words, a poem doesn't have to be didactic. It doesn't have to teach a lesson, right? There isn't some universal truth or theme that has to be identified. And the pleasure from poetry is indefinite. Pleasure from the romance, which is a genre of literature, is definite. So the way I interpret this as poetry is very abstract. Right? When I read a poem, as adults, whenever we read, we bring our schemas into it. And a schema is this, think of it as a computer chip in our brain that holds all the information that we know about a topic. So if we're reading a poem and it's a topic that we know a lot about. We're going to bring in, that prior knowledge. We're going to activate our schema, and we're going to base a lot of our interpretations off that. So that's why then a poem, right, the pleasure that we get out of it comes indefinite. I like to think of it as a song or a book I read. So, listening to Nevermind by Nirvana, that album. It's a little bit, I have a different experience as a much older man. I was alive when Kurt Cobain was alive. I actually saw Nirvana in concert. But now when I listen to it, it's mostly nostalgia. But I remember how I felt during the time when it meant a lot more. And music is an essential element in poetry, right? There's a lot of the auditory elements. Beauty is the sole province of the poem. Right? Poetic beauty is the sole province of the poem. And I like to think that relates back to the pleasure of it. Right? Then think back to the Romantics, the British Romantics. It was all about nature. Transcendentalists, it was about nature. It was about the individualism. Right? Everywhere you looked, you could see God in nature. This beauty. This is interesting here because this might ring a bell for us. A poem must have unity or totality of effect. So think back to the essay that you just turned in or you're still working on, that's fine. Right? This unity of effects paper. Well, Poe thinks that a poem should have the same thing. But how does one do that? Well, again, this kind of relates to Poe's unity of effect theory. Excuse me. Right? Poe believes that a work of fiction needs to be completed in one setting in order for that unity of totality, the unity of effect to work, right? So the same thing with a poem. A poem must be brief. Passion and poetry are discordant. So discordant means they don't necessarily have to relate to one another. And I want to go back to this unity part, right? Poem must have unity or totality. And one of the ways that Poe does this is with sound. And I will demonstrate that when I do another video on how to read a poem. And I think I'm going to use one of Poe's poems called The Veil. All right, so continuing on how Poe and Coleridge relate. We'll get into this idea of the imagination versus fancy. So how Poe and Coleridge agree on imagination's influence is that both would argue that the imagination is the soul of poetry, but it's the creation part where they differ. We'll talk about it. It harmonizes diverse matters and gives unity to variety. I just mentioned on the last slide that one of the ways to unify different ideas is through sound, and that sound could be a rhyme scheme. The sound could be different types of repetition, like we saw in The Raven. Right? Imagination, it is analogous to the creative power of God. Although, again, I would argue that Poe and Coleridge are a little bit different. And we'll get to that in a minute. All right, of two elements known and unlike, it can create a third element from either. So this is how they relate, right? And this will make more sense in a minute when we get to the slide here. I titled the slide Foes because this is where they kind of disconnect. How they differ. Well, they differ in this idea of imagination versus fancy and the creation part, where a poet kind of finds his muse, right? A couple of quotes from Coleridge, not from our book, from another article that I read. All right, so on imagination, right, this is Coleridge. All right, so imagination is thinking creatively and applying the imagination to shape a new picture. Fancy means a thing that is produced out of materials that already exist and combining different things to create a new one. Now check out Poe's idea, right, of creation. Creation by the imagination is merely the combination of whole parts of known objects in a new way. So where they kind of fall into place, or where they agree with one another, is Coleridge's idea of fancy, right? Poe thinks that, right, the the human imagination is different than, say, God's, right? And I know we talked about, what is Poe, a theist or a pantheist? I'm sorry, a deist or a pantheist. But still, Poe did argue that, God could imagine something out of nothing, but humans can't, right? Humans, right, when they imagine things, it's like I mentioned, the schema. It's already something that they know about. So this is where they differ then, right? So Coleridge believes that the imagination kind of diffuses, right? And out of that chaos stems something out of nothing. Almost like a Big Bang Theory type thing. Whereas Poe's idea of imagination is, no, there already has to be something in place. So that's how they differ. Right. So thanks for listening, and be sure and read the article. I know it's dense, but it has a lot more content than what I just summed up here.